Hello, I would like to welcome you all to our fourth session of the conference cycle, New Directions in Social Hermeneutics. Today we have with us, we have the pleasure of having with us Arto Laitinen from Tampere University and George Taylor from the University of Pittsburgh. This session will be dedicated to the main topic, ideology, utopia, and social pathologies. And we have two excellent talks by two great guests coming up. So I'll start and introduce Arto first because he's going to do the first talk. And then after Arto's talk, I'll introduce George. And so Arto Laitinen is a professor of social philosophy at Tampere University in Finland. He is a very well-known name within the fields of critical theory, recognition theory, social ontology, which are some of his main theoretical interests. And he is doing a talk on the topic interpreting social suffering, diagnosing social pathologies, and so really in clear connection with some of our main concerns in this conference cycle, and also resonating both with hermeneutics and critical theory. I very much look forward to your presentation, Arto. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gonzalo, for this kind invitation. It's really exciting to be here. I'll start by putting the screen share on. Here's the title, and the talk will be a kind of combination of work already done and work not yet done. So I will hold on. Yep. So I will start with some introduction, give some background, and as a warning, this might seem you longish, given that it's an introduction, and then the final punchline section has a warning that it might seem to you shortish. But to already plant one question to your mind, I have one idea of how Paul Ricoeur's philosophy, or the idea of hermeneutics of detours, might be relevant to what I'm addressing here. So I'm in the discussion, I hope that I hear some comments on that. I know that there will be Ricoeur experts in the audience who know this stuff better than I do. But without further ado, I'll start with some background. So Axel Honneth defined the task of social philosophy in a couple of articles in 2007 and 2009. He defined the task of social philosophy in terms of pathology diagnosis, or that of critical theory as diagnosis and therapy of social pathologies. So on this approach, social philosophy doesn't start from normative ideals, doesn't provide a theory of justice, and then work from there to an analysis of the current society, but start from the analysis of the criticizable aspects of the social world as it is currently. So it starts from prevailing social wrongs, social pathologies, social evils, defects, dysfunctions, or bads, and so on. And social pathologies is one conceptualization of these existing social defects. The main idea is that these defects are easily epistemically accessible to those whose social life the arrangements shape. After all, they live with those. They experience the injustices, disrespect, discrimination, and so on in their lives. So this kind of experienced social suffering is a more secure entry to the realm of social normativity and social wrongs than elaborate philosophical constructions with various contested moves and so on. After all, we know that philosophers typically disagree on each step of any complicated matters. So we have a better grasp of lived injustice than the details of the theory of justice as such. Even though both might ultimately be needed, both understanding of the ideals and understanding of the pathologies. Here's just a a quote from Axel Honneth from 1981. Quote, in the case of socially suppressed strata, the ideas of justice, according to which social groups morally evaluate and judge a social order, are more likely to be found in typical perceptions of injustice than in positively formulated principles of value. End quote. And the list of examples of social pathologies or social wrongs that this tradition of critical social theory typically works with is not limited to mere injustice, but it includes economic exploitation, domination, power inequalities, powerlessness, loss of freedom, misrecognition, all sorts of invisibilization, reification, and so on. The case that I will be using today is the colonization of life world by the economic system and power systems that Jürgen Habermas has proposed. And for this kind of list of what the examples of social pathologies are, this list resembles much that provided by Chris Zorn. With Arvi Särkelä, we have an ongoing project of analyzing this approach to social philosophy, these understandings of social wrongs or social pathologies. And we've distinguished 2 approaches and 4 conceptions, so 2 conceptions under both approaches. And we distinguish the approaches with what we have called the Euthyphro dilemma of social philosophy. So this echoes the traditional Euthyphro problems, and it says that is something wrong because it is a social pathology, or is something a social pathology because it is wrong in a pathological way? So we have 2 understandings, and we call normativism the idea that we understand that something is wrong, a social wrong, and whether we decide to call it a social pathology or not then is perhaps not that important. Or then we have views that we call naturalism, which say that there's actually good support for starting with the idea of social pathology, that it's informative and it actually tells us why something is a social wrong, a socially criticizable aspect. And we distinguish 2 of these normativist views. One is so-called anti-theoretical view, where the concept of social pathology is merely seen as an family resemblance concept and not very informative, that all the heavy weightlifting is done with the notion of social wrong, which differs from individual moral wrongs in that they are something like structural injustices or other types of defects of the social arrangements. Or then we have this kind of structural view, which says that all pathologies actually do share a feature, so that in addition to them being social wrongs, we call them pathological when they have these or those kinds of interesting features. Or then where we think that interesting work is to be done is that you can choose a naturalistic approach and say that actually the concept of social pathology, despite all the criticisms, which I'll go to soon, is actually a fruitful concept still nowadays. And again, we distinguish 2 approaches. One view says that societies are like organisms, that they can be ill, they can be sick. When we say that some society is sick or ill, we actually mean it more or less literally. But as this view is, we think with Arvi Särkelä, this view is to be criticized. We shouldn't think that societies are like organisms. Then the view that there's nonetheless point in using pathology literature, or pathology conceptualization, can draw on the idea of life, so that social life as a whole is sufficiently similar to biological life. There can be, it can deteriorate. There can be pathological kind of self-affirming processes, like vicious circles that take place in social life. So for us, the motivation for naturalist pathology vocabulary doesn't come from the idea of society as an organism, but from the idea of social life. And we have put forward this distinction of 4 conceptions to help the debate. These kinds of maps should be of help to anyone, whatever your position is. And we also compare them with 6 criteria that I will go into now. The idea is that you can measure or conceptions of social pathology. And in naturalist view, goes on the idea of social life. And then we can ask, how are the 2 ideas of starting from social suffering and then having the task of analyzing Nell van den Haag? Yeah, thanks. Analyzing social pathologies, how are they related? So in a recent book, Fred Neuhauser, Diagnosing Social Pathology, suggests that experiences of social suffering are indeed the hallmark of social illness, but that doesn't imply that socially caused suffering is either a necessary or a sufficient feature of social pathology. And he mentions Durkheim's and Marxist views that there are plenty of illnesses that don't involve experienced suffering either. And sometimes when you're alienated, you feel confirmed and at ease in your alienated state. So necessarily you don't experience any suffering. It might be bad for your life and kind of an obstacle to your vital ends, but you don't kind of experience this kind of suffering. So there are false positives. Not all social suffering is a response to genuine social ills. Neuhauser mentions the example of someone being outraged at seeing hijab wearing women on their streets. And then again, Nietzsche's idea that some suffering, as in pregnancy, is related to growth and possibilities rather than degeneration or dysfunction, so that we shouldn't too tightly connect the experiences of social suffering and the existence of social pathology. And this means that there's need for interpretation. Social theorists and the social movements and the sufferers must interpret suffering and judge it in the light of normative criteria. That was a quote, and here's another quote. This may sound harsh or paternalistic, but it's nevertheless true that social suffering must be articulated and made comprehensible to those who don't suffer from it if social transformation is to occur. So then he lists some examples where this has been successfully done. Like only some people actually experience the wrongings, but it can be articulated, put to words so that everyone sees that wronging has taken place and that, or that there's something pathological in the social arrangements. So that, quote, the idea is to translate the suffering into terms that those not directly afflicted can come to understand as ethically compelling. Then more briefly, Neuhauser starts or mentions some disadvantages of the concept of social pathology, which are good to put aside. These are indeed genuine disadvantages. They have it has pretty bad track record all the way, including Nazi ideology. For US sociologists, social pathology is linked with social deviance, and the cure is more or less obedience. Spencer's social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, used this vocabulary of pathologies. Ontologically, there's the unease at the idea that society is an organism. And then there's the idea that this is conceptually so loose that whatever one disapproves of, one can call it sick, so that we should have some kind of understandings of what is and what is not a sick society, or what is an illness of the social body, as it were. And there's the idea, two understandings, either seeing them as organisms or then as alive. And here Honeth and Neuhauser seem to think that both are needed. With Arvi Särkelä, we are more opposed to the idea of organism talk in this context. But then there are also advantages that Neuhauser mentions. It broadens the scope of social wrongs from justice to other things. Calling pathologies injustices under-describes them. For example, global warming. It's hard to avoid the impression that, quote, there is something sick or perverse or gravely awry, but in any case, something more than unjust about social practices for which we are responsible, that systematically thwart fundamental human ends. In this case, ends as simple as those deriving from our biological nature. And on Neuhauser's understanding, pathologies are not isolated actions, but, quote, ongoing social processes that constitute a dynamic with a coherent logic and point. And another quote, there's a self-reproducing nexus of collective practices that, apart from its connection to injustice, diminishes the good or impedes the ends of those who participate in those practices, end quote. So more or less, the idea is, or the Honethian and Neuhauserian interest in social pathology is interest in the social defects that critical theory has always been interested in. And then there's a new observation that perhaps this talk about pathologies, illnesses, sick societies could be actually used for progressive ends and not merely for the less admirable ends. Some people hold that we can independently grasp the idea of social wrongs, and they're not that interested in using the social pathology talk, but maybe Neuhauser and Honeth are right that there's something to this talk of social pathology in the end. For our purposes today, we can, if you don't like the concept of social pathology, you may kind of hear it as mention of social wrongs. Okay, so today's structure then, the question is that if we understand this idea of topic of social philosophy as social life, then which picture of social life plus social theorist should we adopt? And I use this distinction between three different views: direct hermeneutics or life worldly approach, various kinds of dualisms, or then this kind of strong hermeneutics which aims at overcoming these dualisms while retaining their positive aspects. And I will use this colonization of the life world by the system as the example case. So in these three different views, there are three different understandings of how the social philosophers, social theorists, social critics are related in relation to the social life. Is the philosopher just another participant, a fellow citizen, as it were, an outsider, someone staring at Plato's sun, perhaps, or perhaps a participant with an essential special function to social life? So should we understand social life so that this process of self-criticism and self-transformation is actually essential to social life? And to anticipate, we are trying to develop the third answer, I am trying in this talk, and with Arvi Särkelä in our joint work elsewhere, we are trying to develop it. Here. So that was the lengthy introduction. Now let's go to the first hermeneutical or direct hermeneutics approach. This is very well founded approach. Social life, after all, requires participatory understandings from the participants for its very existence or for being maintained in existence. Communitarianism, the collective intentionality approach in social ontology, for example, approach this, and the Michael Tomasello's example of a chimpanzee in a supermarket can be used to illustrate this. A chimpanzee in a supermarket doesn't realize that you're not allowed to eat the bananas while doing the shopping, that you have to go and pay them first. We kind of are so accustomed to living in the sea of social understandings and norms that we need these kinds of examples to show that indeed these participatory understandings are everywhere. We kind of swim in the sea of participatory understandings. These understandings include evaluative and normative conceptions, understandings of the good and the right. And once the participants can see or experience these being violated, they are also competent social critics. In the idea of Michael Walzer, everyone knows how to complain. But Axel Honneth has the important point that people's abilities to articulate their suffering may vary. But more or less on this approach, the role of the theorist or social philosopher is more or less to be a participant, an articulator, sharp-eyed journalist telling fellow citizens what's going on. Sometimes this view is held to be too conservative, but certainly change is possible. Living traditions may change and evolve gradually in a new rat's boat, as it were. But it may be that too radical or revolutionary transformations are an anathema for this approach, that rejecting or trying to reject too much of the shared cultural background would sink the boat, as it were, or might do it. And as the example case, we can use money, as that's relevant for the colonization of the life world idea. When we understand the nature of a good, something like whether it's a service or a prize for a competition or a voting right, we understand the principles by which it is to be distributed in the society. This is Michael Walzer's claim in his book Spheres of Justice, and in his other books he claims that, for example, in Interpretation and Social Criticism, that indeed this kind of participatory view is the privileged view for understanding and criticizing the society. And on this understanding, market exchange is the right principle of distribution concerning some goods. Some things are indeed meant to be for sale and freely exchangeable. Many things not, though. They ought to be distributed otherwise, and they ought to be something that money can't buy. So there's something that Walzer analyzes as domination by money. Things that shouldn't be for sale or which should be distributed equally, like voting rights, or to the needy, or according to need, medical services, or according to merit, such as Nobel Prizes or Olympic prizes, they shouldn't be for sale on free markets. So these life worldly understandings can tell us that something is going wrong in society when money dominates other principles. And on this view, there might be no need for deeper structural analysis of what we'll see is the domination of the life world by a system. One can see from the surface level, as it were, where and when money has overstepped its limits or economic exchanges. When, for example, non-economic institutions start guiding their actions on market models. So here's a type of analysis of colonization or domination by money with life worldly resources only. Money oversteps its area of validity when things that ought not to be for sale are for sale, and that's it. In a sense, then one sphere of the life world dominates another, and no reference to any background mechanisms or systems whose understandings would require distancing from the participatory perspectives are needed here. And in the interest of time, I'll skip those problems and go in general problems that have motivated various types of dualisms. against this well-grounded kind of direct participatory approaches. There have been ontological, epistemic, and moral worries. Does the direct approach capture the importance of dynamic systems or structures which are important to the reproduction and integration of social life? Maybe this, what we have so far is a too flat ontology in the term of Schatzky, for example. That isn't there more to social reality than meets the participants' immediate eyes? Or is this too conservative, as it were? Should there be normatively motivated transformations or calls for transformations that this view cannot deliver? Is this less than fully critical, given the heavy reliance on prevailing common sense understandings? Or is there sufficient weight given to the importance of experts and expert knowledge with a claim for objectivity or epistemic superiority to common sense understandings? Isn't it really so that in some cases the experts really do know better? For example, avoid common sense biases. For example, Neuhauser in this book claims that social critique requires social theory to kind of have whole social practices and institutions in view. Okay, so these are the problems, and unsurprisingly, then these have motivated dualistic proposals epistemically to say that there are privileged positions, for example, in Bourdieu's critical sociology, in calling for an objective distanced standpoint to avoid participant biases, for example. So there's a split between life-worldly and epistemic expert knowledge. In moral or normative cases, for example, Habermas's Kantian dualism in moral theory, and then ontological aspects, for example, Habermas's sociological dualism between systems and the life world, which is to be discussed here. So we saw how the direct hermeneutical approach can deal with money dominating other distribution principles, but perhaps there's more to be said, that there's more to be understood in, for example, capitalist systems, its dynamics, regularities, or its nature in general. The system may work partly behind the backs of the participants, so a methodological access is needed that supersedes the limits of life-worldly participants' interpretive perspective. Or that's the idea, claim of dualisms. And Habermas has claimed or proposed that we conceive of societies simultaneously as systems and as life worlds. And there's a view about how that view can prove itself. For these two aspects of society, social integration and system integration are the two notions that capture how these produce social order. One is based on intersubjective aim at shared understanding, social integration, whereas then system integration kind of relies on or it aims at stabilizing non-intended interconnections of action by way of functionally intermeshing action consequences, whereas the mechanism of mutual understanding harmonizes the action orientations of participants. So these two different ways of societal integration, social integration, and system integration are to be distinguished. And then Habermas has a view that even though this dualism is as such fine, it can happen that then the system colonizes the life-worldly thing. The system integration colonizes or replaces the social integration. So sometimes systemic mechanisms suppress forms of social integration, even in those areas where a consensus-dependent coordination of action cannot be replaced. So for Habermas, it might be fine that in economy, the system integration works. It's good if markets are functional, but then it starts to invade areas in civil society and family and schooling, and where it shouldn't be the guiding principle. So there we have colonization, and it's for Habermas, this is an important form of social pathology that causes disturbances in the symbolic reproduction of the life world, and it creates subjectively experienced identity-threatening crises or pathologies. So that here Habermas claims that social suffering, social pathologies are related to this dual perspective of system overstepping its limits. And then Habermas has a specific view of when this kind of colonization is possible, under what kind of modern conditions. I'll skip the details. And here's just a summary of Habermas's views. And there have been some discussions. The heyday of Habermasianism seems to be over, but I think it's easy to agree that those interested in social pathologies, at least, would benefit from attention to Habermas's colonization thesis. Okay, so much for the dualistic approach that has been here illustrated by Habermas's distinction between life world and system. There are, of course, downsides of dualism as well. One downside of the dualist views is that the normative critic, expert, critical sociologist of Dugia, or the critical philosopher, or the moral consciousness in Habermas's dualism, are somehow placed outside social life. That they are, I mean, meant to be post-conventional, that they are not merely obeying the meanings or conventions of the social world, but somehow they can rise above them. And thereby social life is seen as not containing them as its aspect. So they are somehow placed outside social life, that they are observers from outside who thereby can give critical or objective attention to the downsides of the social life or social pathologies. And there are two different criticisms. One is that these kinds of dualisms obviously don't work. They are a distraction and shouldn't be tried, that direct hermeneutics suffices, that these kinds of critics who lose sight of the social world are not better equipped than Tomasello's chimpanzees in the supermarket, that they just have lost hold of the phenomenon itself. Or then other criticism of dualism is that, well, actually, they may bring epistemic gains, like the expert knowledge and understanding the dynamics of capitalism and so on. They do bring epistemic gains that the participant view as such wouldn't allow us to have. But they are in fact continuous with the life world. They are not outside it, but they are kind of more of the same rather than dualism. So then the question for the third part of the talk is, can the good sides of the two approaches, the life worldly approach and then the dualistic approach, can they be combined? And here we are entering the area where I hope that you can take this more as a kind of question than a report of work done. Here are the questions still more in more detail, that what are the kind of benefits of dualism? Can one have plausible non-dualist epistemic story about experts, science, and so on? Here, I think that Ricker's hermeneutics of detours via analysis is actually a good model. I mean, many people in social sciences or philosophy of social sciences are methodological pluralists. And I think that's a very promising view to have. we have a plurality of expert viewpoints, not merely one dualism, but a plurality of them. And each of them may give something that we wouldn't get either via the direct participatory approach, but then we need kind of to have a detour via those methods. They are not the last word either. So we need kind of reappropriation of these results from these different viewpoints. I'll say something more about that still. So the idea is that what we have here is a kind of incomplete ongoing synthesis of these methodologically achieved insights, fragmented set of insights rather than, for example, Hegelian full synthesis. And can we have a plausible non-dualist story of morality? Here, I think that there's a kind of disanalogy of how we should, what we should think about normative understandings and scientific understandings. Here too, some methods like Rawlsian original position thought experiment, for example, may in principle add to our life world the moral understandings, correct existing biases, and so on. But here the idea is that they must be accessible to everyone here. Whereas in science, certain type of blind trust in experts is fitting. In moral cases, that's perhaps not so. So moral knowledge should be essentially egalitarian. But there's a further complication here. So far, I've spoken as if the life worldly thing is one thing for all humans, but of course we know that there are several cultures. So the direct hermeneutics or the kind of intuitionist pluralism that comes with it, it is right that participants in different cultural practices have privileged access to the evaluative points of the practices they are acquainted with. And no one can take part in all practices. So there must be a kind of division of labor, at least concerning cultural practices. And concerning them, I have thought that we could put forward a kind of potential universalism. If some cultural practice is of value for members of some culture or people who engaged in that practice, it is possible for other cultures to learn from them. For example, Charles Taylor has made good work in how this is supposed to work, and we can simply rely on his work there, And then can one retain these insights of this dualism while rejecting ontological dualism? I think this is relatively easy. Merely state that there is only one world, which is not revealed entirely to the immediate direct common sense interpretive viewpoints, or even with further interpretations via learning from other cultures. But we may need some methodic detours, for example, to understand the dynamics of capitalism. And so this simple answer would say that while the worldviews are fragmented, our epistemic presentations, the world is not fragmented, but that would lose sight of the constitutive nature of interpretations. Some aspects, perhaps very kind of central aspects of the cultural social world are constituted in interpretations. So maybe the world, interpreted world, is fragmented as well. But here, the worry that dualism had, that the critic is not part of the social life, we can nonetheless retain the idea that, of course, the critic or expert or scientist or philosopher is part of the social life. And we can let that inform our privileged view of social life. This is something that Arvi Särkelä defended in his dissertation. That it's of the essence of social life to be self-transformative, so that it's not proper social life if it reduces to the level of mere reproduction like biological life, but social life is such that it's essentially self-transformative. And so the critics who point out the defects and help bring out this self-transformation are not external to the social life, but they are very much in the center of social life. They have an essential function. They are not outsiders, but they are kind of essential part, as social life is essentially self-transformative. Okay, so that's the kind of programmatic answer of how to overcome dualism. I think I've used my my time here. I'll just say that Hegel has a very strong view about all of this, but I would be interested in applying Paul Ricoeur's idea of hermeneutics via detours to this kind of idea, that the dualist viewpoints, which seem to be worth preserving, we might take that stand that Ricoeur suggests that we take to these analysis or methods that we proceed via a detour. So if you have something interesting to say about that, I'm all ears, and I guess I'll just stop here and thank you for your attention.